She was called a worthless girl with bad luck. On the day the great King Satakalawa's son arrived from America to choose a bride, Amanatala was not draped in silk or dancing for the court. She was sent to the riverbank in her torn, dusty wrapper to fetch water, while others shook their waists to charm royalty. Dressed in rags that barely covered her bruised shoulders, she balanced a heavy yellow bucket on her head, unaware that the man she was about to meet would see past her poverty to the queen hidden within. Everyone believed she was the girl who didn't belong in a palace, but at the water's edge, fate was preparing an encounter that would change her life forever. If you're just tuning into this channel, please subscribe, give this video a thumbs up, and don't forget to share with your friends and family, and tell us where you're watching from in the comments section. The rooster had not yet announced the arrival of the sun, but Amanatala was already awake, her feet dragging across the cold earth of the compound. In one hand, she gripped a rusty iron bucket, and in the other, a ragged broom that had seen better years. Her stomach rumbled with a hunger she had learned to ignore, and her knees wobbled from the weight of a body that had not known rest in far too long. She dared not stop. In this house, a single dead leaf left on the veranda was an invitation for a slap or a storm of insults from Madame Dorothy. The sky remained a deep, bruised purple as the wind bit at her bare arms. Amanatala bent low, scrubbing the hard floor with water she had fetched from the stream in the dark, her lips moving in a silent, rhythmic prayer. Let today pass in peace. But peace was a stranger to a girl branded as a curse. Just as she was wringing out the wet rag, a voice like thunder boomed from the main house. Useless girl! Are you still there playing with water? Madame Dorothy's voice sliced through the morning air. Who will wash the toilet? Who will warm the water for your sister? Are you waiting for your ancestors to come down and do your work for you? Amanatala flinched, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She scrambled to her feet, snatched her bucket, and dashed toward the backyard before the first blow could land. Before the sun had fully crested the horizon, she had already trekked to the stream and back, swept every inch of the red dirt compound, washed the mountain of dishes from the night before, and prepared the firewood for the kitchen. She worked in a silence that had become her only companion. She remembered a time when this house smelled of her mother Ifunyanyi's rich soups and rang with her gentle laughter. Those were the days of warm embraces and safety. But since her mother's passing, her father, Chief Chibuzo, had become an empty shell, sitting under the mango tree for hours and staring into nothingness. He no longer called her his angel. He no longer saw her at all. As she worked, the village neighbors would pass by the low wall of the compound, their whispers carrying on the breeze. Look at that girl, roaming like a stray goat, they would say. She carries the bad luck of a motherless child. Amanatala would simply lower her head, focusing on the dust beneath her feet. She was the girl who walked alone, the one who ate cold scraps in the kitchen, while her half-sister Marayope was fed with a silver spoon. Madame Dorothy had once been kind, too kind, bringing her new dresses and calling her sweetheart when she first arrived. Amanatala's heart had swelled with the hope that the pain was finally over. But the moment Marayope was born, the smiles evaporated like mist in the heat. The pet names turned into bad luck and goat, and the gentle touches became thunderous shouts and heavy beatings. Now, Amanatala was a soldier fighting a war without weapons. She was the invisible servant in her father's house, a shadow that moved between the well and the hearth. She did not cry anymore. She just breathed, carrying her bucket and her burden, waiting for the day to end so she could dream of a life where her name didn't taste like an insult. In the quiet moments when the chores were done and the moon hung low over the compound, Amanatala would close her eyes and reach for the fading scent of her mother, Ifunyanyi's. It was a fragrance that lingered in the corners of her soul, a mixture of groundnut soup, lavender perfume, and the sweet, clean smell of a home filled with joy. Once upon a time, the walls of Chief Chibuzo house did not echo with screams, but with the soft, bright laugh of a woman who was the jewel of the village. Amanatala could still feel the phantom warmth of her mother's embrace, a sanctuary that was full and safe, providing a shield against the world before she was old enough to understand the cold finality of death. Her mother's hands had been gentle, always finding a way to smooth the tangles from Amanatala's hair or the worries from her brow. In those days, Amanatala was not a servant, but an angel. She remembered dancing in the living room with her father, his laughter booming as he spun her around, his kisses light upon her forehead. Chief Chibuzo had been a proud, confident man whose eyes sparkled whenever he looked at his wife and daughter. But when the light of Ifunyanyi's life was extinguished, something inside the chief snapped like a dry twig in Harmattan. The day of the funeral had marked the end of more than just a life. It was the day the man she called Papa became an empty shell. Amanatala watched as he retreated into a fortress of silence. The kisses stopped. The dancing ended. He began to spend his days sitting under the ancient mango tree, staring into the horizon as if waiting for a ghost to manifest from the heat haze. He would chew his stick slowly, blinking at the sky, utterly unreachable to the little girl who stood at the door, watching him with an aching heart. As the weeks turned into months, the vibrant man she knew vanished entirely, replaced by a shadow who simply existed. He no longer noticed if Amanatala had eaten or if her clothes were torn. The villagers' whispers began then, sharp and unkind, noting how the little girl roamed like a stray goat while her father remained lost in his grief. Amanatala learned to be quiet because noise seemed to hurt him. She learned to be invisible because he no longer had the strength to see her. It was this hollow silence that paved the way for the kinsman to intervene, insisting that a young man could not raise a child alone and that the compound needed the hand of a new woman. Amanatala had hoped that a new mother might bring her father back to life, but she didn't realize that the echoes of Ifunyanyi's were all she would ever have of true love in that house. The arrival of Madame Dorothy was heralded by a sweetness that felt, to Amanatala's starving heart, like the first rains after a long drought. In those early days, the woman was a fountain of affection, showering the motherless girl with new dresses and spending hours combing the tangles from her hair. She would pull Amanatala onto her lap, calling her sweetheart and my daughter as she carefully fed her rice and stew with a spoon. Amanatala's heart swelled with a hope she had almost forgotten how to feel. She boasted to the village children that her new mommy was even better than the old one, believing that the cold season of her life had finally come to an end. But this happiness was a fragile glass that shattered the very moment Madame Dorothy gave birth to her own daughter, a fair-skinned and plump girl named Marayope. Almost overnight, the warmth in the house turned into a biting frost. The pet names were the first to vanish, replaced by a sharp, clinical coldness. Then came the scoldings, tiny at first, like the prick of a needle. Amanatala, you didn't wash that plate well. Amanatala, you're walking like a goat. Amanatala, are you deaf? The woman who had once cradled her now looked at her with eyes that saw nothing but an obstacle. The transformation was soon complete, as if a switch had been flipped in the dark. The morning gentleness was replaced by thunderous shouts that rattled the window panes. Wake up, you this bad luck. Who will sweep this place? Madame Dorothy would scream, her face twisted in a permanent mask of disdain. She made it clear that Amanatala was no longer a daughter, but a servant meant to labor while Marayope was pampered. The beatings began shortly after, sharp stings to her arms and legs that left bruises she tried to hide behind her tattered wrapper. Throughout this shift, the silence of Chief Chibuzo remained absolute. Amanatala tried, just once, to reach him. She sat beside him under the mango tree as he peeled an orange and whispered, "Papa, Madame Dorothy beats me a lot." He did not even turn his head. He merely chewed his stick slowly and muttered that she should be more respectful before returning to his staring contest with the sky. That was the day the last flicker of hope died in Amanatala's chest. She realized that in this house, she was a soldier fighting a war without weapons, a shadow living under the growing, suffocating darkness of Dorothy's rule. By the time Amanatala reached her 18th year, the harsh sun and the salt of her tears had failed to dim the light that radiated from within her. Nature seemed to have its own plans for her, crafting a beauty that was quiet and deep, the kind that did not require the shimmering oils or imported powders that Madame Dorothy lavished upon Marayope. Despite the relentless labor that cracked her palms and the tattered, oversized wrappers that hung from her frame, Amanatala's skin glowed with the resilience of polished mahogany. Her eyes, though often cast downward to avoid conflict, held a spark that could melt stones when she dared to smile, a rare occurrence that felt like a hidden treasure to those few who witnessed it. She had become a woman of grace, her movements fluid and rhythmic even as she balanced heavy jerry cans or swung a heavy scythe in the fields. This transformation did not go unnoticed by the village boys or the men from neighboring towns who visited Umudik. Suitors began to appear at the compound gate, drawn by tales of the first daughter of Chief Chibuzawilam, the girl whose beauty was like a wildflower thriving in a desert. However, before any of these men could even speak to her father, Madame Dorothy would intercept them like a spider guarding a web. She would sit them down on the veranda, her face twisted into a mask of feigned maternal concern, and whisper poison into their ears. "She is not normal," Dorothy would breathe, her voice hushed as if sharing a painful secret. She told them that Amanatala was possessed by marine spirits, that she would stare at blank walls for hours in a trance, or that she still suffered from the embarrassing ailments of a child. "She carries the bad luck of her mother," she would add, shaking her head as the suitor's expressions shifted from admiration to fear. Then, with a practiced smile, she would point toward the house where Marayope sat fanned by a rechargeable fan, her skin fresh and her hands uncalloused. "But my daughter, she is the one who is trained and clean," she would boast. One by one, the men would disappear, leaving the compound with confused and hurried faces. Amanatala would watch them go from the small, soot-stained window of the kitchen, her heart sinking a little further each time. She began to believe the lies herself, wondering if she was indeed destined to die in this village, an invisible servant fetching water and washing plates until her back finally broke. Yet, even in this profound isolation, she could not find it in her heart to hate Marayope or the woman who worked so hard to erase her. She simply tightened the knot of her wrapper, lifted her bucket, and continued to wait, not for a miracle or a prince, but merely for the strength to survive another day. The dust of Umudik had never felt so thick as it did the morning the royal convoy rolled through the village square, led by the rhythmic clang of the ogene and the sharp, clear blast of the royal trumpets. "Gather round. All households with maidens, come out and hear," the crier's voice boomed, carrying across the heat-stilled air of the marketplace. Amanatala stood at the edge of the road, a yellow jerrycan balanced precariously on her head, her heartbeat quickening as the announcement unfurled like a royal carpet. Prince Adekunlemi, the son of the great King Satakalawa, had finally returned from America to choose a bride from among the village girls. In 7 days, a dancing competition would determine who would sit beside the prince as his queen. The village erupted in a frenzy of ululations and desperate excitement. Mothers began dragging their daughters toward the shops to buy soaps and oils that promised to make their skin shine like mirrors. For a fleeting moment, a small, fragile smile tugged at Amanatala's lips. Perhaps this was the moment her life of labor would end. But the hope died the instant she crossed the threshold of her father's compound. Madame Dorothy's voice shook the very rafters of the house. "God has remembered us. Marayope, your time has come. We must seize this prince before any other girl uses charms on him." While Marayope spun in her house slippers, dreaming of palace gold, Amanatala quietly set her water down by the kitchen door. The next day, the house was transformed into a royal training camp. Madame Dorothy returned from the market with silken wrappers, shimmering waist beads, and northern oils meant only for her biological daughter. Amanatala was forced to watch as Dorothy rubbed thick creams into Marayope's arms, shouting instructions as if training a boxer for a championship match. "Shake it. Shake your waist like I did when your father saw me. Show class," she barked, while Amanatala swept the dust of their rehearsals from the floor. Gathering a rare spark of courage, Amanatala approached her stepmother that evening, her voice soft and trembling. "Mommy, please. I want to go for the dancing competition, too." The silence that followed was more painful than a physical blow. Madame Dorothy turned slowly, her hands white with beauty powder, and fixed Amanatala with a glare that froze the blood in her veins. "Are you a baby?" Dorothy spat, her words dripping with venom. "Do you want to disgrace your father? You are the first daughter. You should be sacrificing for your sister, not trying to steal her chance. When it is your time, we will prepare you, but this one is for Marayope." Amanatala's lips parted, but no sound came out. She was commanded back to the kitchen to pound yam for the dinner she would barely be allowed to taste. As the days passed, she became the invisible engine behind Marayope's beauty. She boiled the hot water for Marayope's facial steams, massaged her sister's feet with oils, and trekked long distances to find the specific soaps Dorothy demanded, all while her own feet cracked and her back ached with exhaustion. Through it all, Chief Chibuzawilam sat outside, chewing his stick and watching the injustice with ears that seemed to have retired from hearing his daughter's silent cries. Amanatala realized then that the palace was a dream meant for others, while she was destined to remain in the shadows, scrubbing the floors that others would dance upon. The village of Amudik had become a feverish hive of activity as the selection ceremony drew near, but for Amanatala, the excitement was a weight she carried alone. Mothers marched through the streets like soldiers, and daughters soaked their skin in expensive oils, yet Amanatala was driven even harder, forced to fill every water drum in the compound so the future Queen Marayope would not have to manage her own bath water. As she stepped onto the dusty road with her heavy keg, she felt the sting of isolation. Other mothers dragged their children away from her path, shouting for her not to push her bad luck onto their daughters. Her ears burned and her chest tightened, but she held her silence as her only weapon and walked toward the stream. Near a bend in the road, she came upon an old woman named Zainabia, who sat fragile and bent at the base of a large tree. A bundle of firewood lay scattered beside her, and her arms shook with a weakness that had stolen her ability to stand. While others had hissed at the elder or passed her by in their rush toward royalty, Amanatala dropped her keg immediately and rushed to her side. She ran to the stream to bring back clean water, helping the woman drink and using her own scarf to wipe the dust from Zainabia's dry face. Without a second thought for her own exhaustion, Amanatala lifted the heavy firewood onto her head and guided the elder slowly back to her small, overgrown compound at the edge of the village. Finding the yard in disarray, Amanatala's hands did not rest. She swept the dirt, chopped the wood neatly, and started a fire to warm the kitchen while Zainabia watched in silent, blinking surprise. "You have a kind heart," the old woman whispered, her voice thick with a gratitude that Amanatala had not felt in years. Zainabia stepped into her room and returned with a neatly folded wrapper and a string of coral beads that glowed like the rising sun. They were heirlooms intended for her daughter, Temaladiola, but since she had no child to receive them, she pressed them into Amanatala's calloused hands. "Take it. Wear it to the competition," Zainabia commanded, her eyes seeing past Amanatala's rags. Though Amanatala protested that her stepmother would never allow her to go, the elder insisted she reject no blessing and show up despite what others said of her. Holding the gift close to her heart, Amanatala felt a rare, quiet dance of joy within her. As she made her way back to the stream, she pressed the cloth to her chest, feeling that even if she never stepped foot in the palace, she finally possessed something beautiful that was entirely her own. The sun was at its peak, baking the earth of Amudik into a fine red powder that coated Amanatala's ankles as she made her lonely trek to the stream. While the rest of the village was gathered at the palace grounds, she moved with her head slightly bent, the weight of her suffering making her invisible to the few people she passed. When she reached the water's edge, her bones felt like wet sticks, heavy and fragile from a morning spent massaging Marayope's feet and hauling wood for Madame Dorothy. She began to scoop water into her jerrycan with a small bowl, the repetitive motion the only rhythm in the oppressive quiet, until the sound of footsteps on the dry leaves made her flinch. A man approached the bank, dressed simply in a white shirt with sleeves rolled high and brown trousers that bore the dust of the road. He carried no crown and was followed by no guards, yet he held a smile that felt warmer than the afternoon sun. When he asked for a drink, Amanatala did not hesitate. She scooped clean water from the clearest part of the stream into a leaf bowl and handed it to him. He thanked her with an intensity that made her look away, and as they spoke, she realized he was a stranger to the village, perhaps a traveler here for the festivities. "Why aren't you at the palace?" he asked, his eyes searching hers. Amanatala gave a tired, crooked smile, explaining that the palace was not for girls like her, girls who were told their place was fetching water and sweeping floors because they carried bad luck. The stranger's face darkened with a frown, and he reached out to take the heavy jerrycan from her hand. They argued for several minutes, she protesting that a man of his stature shouldn't carry such loads, but he insisted that a woman of her beauty shouldn't be so stressed. He followed her back to the compound, and for the first time in her life, The walk did not feel like a sentence. They talked of the city, of roads with lights that never went out and food she could only imagine, and for a few moments, Amanatala felt like a child again, dreaming of heaven. He helped her fetch water 5 times, carrying every keg himself, and even attempted to help her sweep the yard, though his awkward technique made her burst into a rare, genuine laugh. To thank him, she prepared a simple meal of roasted yam and spicy palm oil sauce with onions, the only food she could offer from her meager stores. They sat together on a mat in the shade, eating with their fingers and laughing like old friends. For a brief hour, the compound was not a prison, and she was not a servant. She was just a girl sharing a meal with a man who truly saw her. But as the distant bark of a dog signaled the impending return of her stepmother, fear flooded back into her chest. She whispered for him to go, terrified of the scandal and the beatings that would follow if they were found together. He stood to leave, looking back at her with a lingering gaze as if he were memorizing her face, leaving Amanatala alone once more with her dusty wrappers and her silent dreams. That night, while Amanatala slept deeply from the exhaustion of her labors, Madame Dorothy crept into her room with the silent precision of a predator. She opened the old box that had belonged to the late Ifunyanese and snatched the shimmering wrapper and the glowing coral beads, hiding them beneath her own clothes. When Amanatala woke and found her only treasures gone, her screams of anguish were met only with Dorothy's cold indifference and claims of her own carelessness. Broken and trembling, Amanatala sat on the floor of her room, believing her bad luck had finally consumed the only light she had ever known. The morning of the selection ceremony arrived with a feverish intensity as Madame Dorothy transformed the compound into a flurry of royal preparation. She forced Amanatala to boil water, mix perfumes, and massage Marayope's limbs until the girl's skin glowed with the radiance of the stolen heirlooms. While Marayope was adorned in the sacred wrapper and beads, Amanatala was forbidden from even watching the festivities. Instead, she was commanded to fetch more firewood, sent away to the forest so her disgraceful presence would not ruin the family's chance at gold. At the palace grounds, the atmosphere was thick with anticipation as the royal convoy arrived, led by Prince Atakunlami. Marayope stood proud, draped in the stolen finery and hidden behind a sacred lace veil, while Madame Dorothy boasted to the crowd that her daughter had already struck gold. Chief Chibuzawilam stood by, dressed in royal regalia provided by the palace, smiling with a sudden, shallow pride. The air was filled with the sound of drummers and the cheers of villagers who believed the selection was a mere formality. The moment of the unveiling finally came, and a hush fell over the assembly as Prince Atakunlami stepped forward. With a firm hand, he lifted the veil, but instead of a smile, his face hardened into a mask of confusion and rejection. "What is this? Who is this?" he demanded, his voice echoing through the silent square. As Madame Dorothy stumbled forward, stammering that this was the chosen bride, the prince shook his head with absolute certainty. "This is not my bride," he declared, his eyes scanning the crowd for the one woman who had shown him true kindness. "The woman I want is Amanatala. She is the maiden of this compound, and I will marry no other." The village square remained under a heavy shroud of silence as the prince's declaration hung in the air like a sudden storm. Madame Dorothy staggered back as if she had been struck by lightning, her face a mask of frozen horror while Marayope stood trembling in her stolen finery. King Satakalawa rose from his throne, his voice commanding as he ordered the royal guards to find the first daughter of Chief Chibuzawilam. "Bring her here," the king commanded, "for nobody moves until the future queen arrives." Deep within the tangled shadows of the forest, Amanatala was bent low, gathering the dry sticks that Madame Dorothy had demanded. Her heart jumped into her throat when she heard the thundering of hooves and saw the palace guards, dressed in royal red, surrounding her small clearing. They did not come with insults or whips. Instead, they spoke with a reverence that made her knees weak, telling her that the king, the prince, and the entire village were waiting for her return. She dropped her bundle of firewood and followed them, still dazed and covered in the dust of her labor. As she entered the compound, every eye turned toward her in a mixture of awe and disbelief. Prince Atakunlami stepped forward, his eyes shining with the same warmth she had seen at the stream. "You're the prince," she whispered, her voice trembling as she remembered making him sweep and carry water. He laughed softly, admitting his undercover role and stepping closer to take the hands that had served him so selflessly. In that moment, the silent chief Chibuzo suddenly found his voice, shouting to the heavens that his daughter had married royalty, though Amanatala only saw the man who had ignored her suffering for so long. She was led to the royal carriage and swept away to the palace, where the tattered wrappers of her past were replaced by gowns of woven gold and necklaces of heavy coral. The transformation was complete. The girl who was once mocked as bad luck and sent to fetch water now sat on a throne beside her prince. Those who had once spat at her shadow now bowed low, their heads touching the dirt she used to sweep. Even as she moved from grass to grace, Amanatala's heart remained as pure as the water she once fetched. Despite the years of cruelty, she did not seek revenge against those who had tried to crush her spirit. She built a new house for Madame Dorothy and her father, providing them with a monthly allowance that ensured they would never know the hunger she had endured. Yet the distance remained. Whenever she visited, they could not look her in the eye, their heads bowed in a shame that no amount of royal gold could wash away. Amanatala looked out over her kingdom and smiled, realizing that the very path her stepmother had forced her onto, the path to the stream, was the one that had led her to her crown. The rejected girl had finally found her home, proving that even the longest night must eventually give way to the morning sun.